Hello YouTube, it's Supernova back with more Explain 11, and we're here in the stock Cessna 172 going through the startup procedure. No need to prime the engine. Beacon light on, and we're now ready to actually start the engine. Mixture rich, and that's it. No need to prime the engine as we would do with the Airfoil Labs 172 or the stock 172 with the Reality expansion pack. And we're using default weather, so everything is pretty much stock. Keeping it as simple as possible for this flight. We're going to be going from Nice to Marseille, which is a flight west down the French Mediterranean coast. And looking at leaning the mixture. I always lean the mixture on the Cessna 172 with RPM. I don't lean on EGT. That is going to become more complicated with more complicated aircraft. The great thing about the Cessna 172 of course is that it is a very simple aircraft. Have a little bit of activity at the airport, but I'm not using world traffic for this flight. World traffic tends to have aircraft taking off at runway 04 regardless of the wind conditions. I don't understand why it does that. I've read the explanation on the forum, can't quite understand what that's about. Entering a European VFR code for the transponder and setting it to standby.
Nice,
and now getting the ATIS.
1200 Zulu.
Okay, we'll be taking off from
visibility
runway 22 left.
Sky clear, temperature 16. Dew point -23.
And that becomes important when we're setting up
2992.
the flight
Driving
plan.
runway 22 left.
Of course, here on the
Departing
ground we can
runway
only
22 left.
set the standard instrument departure. The star and approach will come later as we approach Marseille. So set heading for runway 22. And now we can start to create the flight plan itself. If any of this is confusing or you'd like more information on it, there are tutorials on the channel. There's a specific tutorial on creating a flight plan with the Garmin 430. So that's where we are now, Nice, and we'll enter Marseille. And when we have that done, we have the departure and destination. Always important before you start out to delete the existing flight plan. But there is a very basic flight plan. We could go direct to Marseille at this point, but instead we'll define the or select the standard instrument departure, which is Lenco 6 X-ray. So we're going to be looking for the departure chart that leaves to the west. It's very simple to find the correct departure chart. You're just looking for a chart that's going to point you in the direction that you want to go. So now we have our basic flight plan sorted out. Struggling to get the right light switch using the throttle quadrant. And now taxiing down to, I actually taxi right down to the end of taxiway uniform to get right to the end of runway 22 left. At Nice, you're taking off on runways 22 left and 04 right, and landing at 22 right and 04 left. Be able to identify taxiway uniform because of the U painted on the taxiway. We're also looking for signs along the taxiway route. And now just moving into the whole short area. Just cutting out that long taxi all the way down uniform and across hotel. So parking brake. And do a very basic run up and preparation for the flight. When I first looked at the stock 172, the magneto test didn't actually work at all. You could look at the left magneto, the right magneto, and they'd be exactly the same as the RPM readout for both. Setting trim for takeoff. And the transponder for altitude. A lot of this is covered in the Airfoil Labs radio stack reference. That is not directly applicable to the stock 172's radio stack, but a lot of the same principles apply. So that done. Taxiing onto the active runway. The difference that I noted between the stock 172 and the Airfoil Labs 172 is in taxiing. It seems to require less power to get the 172 moving. I noticed that specifically on landing at Marseille. It's very difficult to get the Airfoil Labs 172 moving at Marseille. It requires an awful lot of power on the runway and taxiways, as the stock 172 moves without a problem. Even at low RPM settings, it moves fine. So getting somewhat on centre line and applying power. No flaps required for the takeoff. Got plenty of runway, and we're airborne. Again, struggling with the switches. There's no way of assigning the autopilot on switch to a joystick button, which is unfortunate. At least not a way that I've found. For the Airfoil Labs, at least. Probably you can do it with the stock 172. I just haven't set that up yet, I don't think. At least not in this video. But passing 500, activate the autopilot, set navigation, and then allow the aircraft to follow the route. Just going to skip this passage of time over the water. And we are back. And you're looking at awful scenery. Awful scenery doesn't actually take a huge amount of time to learn how to use. Once you've generated the awful for one tile, it becomes quite a simple process. It can take quite a while, however, to create a tile, depending on how much detail
Marseille
that you want to include.
1300 Zulu weather. Wind calm. Visibility more than 10.
Okay, we're at our altitude of 6,000 feet.
Temperature 16. Dew point -23.
At every 1,000 feet level, I'm looking to
Arriving runways 31 right, 31 left.
lean the mixture.
Departing runways 31 right, 31 left. Advise on initial
Again,
contact
always
with
leaning the
Alpha.
mixture on RPM. And now we've got the 80s for Marseille.
Nice code Azure information Alpha.
So we're looking at runway 31.
1300 Zulu weather.
The start for that will be Lanco 8 Charlie, with the initial approach fix of OB 395. Problem you will find with certain airports that you import for free, they're maybe not quite 100% compatible with Explain 11. The runway 13 left at Marseille is particularly hilly, very bumpy, so I prefer not to use it. I'll use 31 left or right, or 13 right. And now that we have the IAF for runway 31, we can set the approach up on that. The approach is also giving us altitudes that we need to fly during the approach. Of course, you're not going to know which approach and which star that you're going to need until you have the ATIS at the destination. And you're looking to get that about 50 miles, 40 to 50 miles out. We're going to be looking for 5,000 feet, 13 miles west of OB 395. And that's the start of the descent. We'll go down to 3,500, and then at the IF we'll be down at 2,000 feet when we turn to the runway heading. But for now we can admire the scenery. As I said, I'm using default weather for this flight, not using Xenviro. Xenviro at this point is at 1.0.7, and that has some issues with it. Hopefully those will be addressed in 1.0.8, but I'm not expecting that until Explain finalizes on 11.1, or until they finalize 11.1. I'm not using 11.1 at the moment because I believe that causes issues with the Dash 8. Some really nice scenery out there. When you're down low, especially the water really looks particularly bad, but it's the same with all flight sims. The higher up you get, the better they look. But that looks certainly very believable. Stock weather has improved a lot since the initial beta release of Explain 11. The clouds are much improved, and it is a viable option to stay with stock weather as opposed to using Xenviro. I would certainly recommend Xenviro. I think it does add a lot to the sim, but you can live with stock weather now in a way that you couldn't before, or that was very difficult to live with before. And of course 1.08 is going to introduce some, or hopefully is going to introduce some really interesting features that I think will really justify its price. The only thing to do at the moment is to admire the scenery. I'm not using ATC. I am waiting for the integration of Pilot to ATC into World Traffic. World Traffic has its issues, but it does add a lot to the immersion of the sim. If you look at FSX, it has traffic, AI traffic built in, and you use something like MyTrafficX to give it more colour, more variety, and then you add that to the default ATC. It is a more immersive experience than basic X-Plane. So X-Plane 11 really does need World Traffic, and World Traffic needs an ATC program that works well with it, and that looks like it's going to be the case with Pilot to ATC. No radio communication required for this flight, so we're just going to admire the views. It's always good to be able to pick out landmarks as you're flying over an area. The great thing about the Cessna 172 is it is very simple. There's not a huge amount that you have to do to manage the aircraft. The greatest task that you have is to make sure that the engine is leaned properly, but even that is very simple, especially if you stick to leaning on RPM. So we have plenty of fuel for the flight. I actually calculated I needed about 18 gallons to make the flight and also to have a reserve. Of course I forgot to set that, but fortunately it came with 20 gallons, so I was safe with that. Now with GPS navigation, flight navigation is really simple. As long as you have your flight plan entered into the 430, all you have to do is set the CDI source to GPS, switch on the autopilot, set it to navigation, and it will go where you need it to go. Okay, we are now working through the approach. We're descending in altitude, we're down at 3,500 feet. If you notice, we are going to turn right in a little while. We're actually flying a noise abatement flight plan to avoid overflying Marseille, which is to the right. So pretty soon we'll take a right turn. We'll fly basically along the coast. And I'm sure if you're familiar with Marseille, you can pick out individual landmarks. The nice thing about the Garmin 530 is you have more information visible on the page. It's a taller display, so if you set VOR DME to nav 1, you'll get DME information on the display, which is very useful. It's one thing that you don't get on the 430. But essentially, it's the same unit. You just have a couple of more functions available to you. If you have a choice between the two, you'd go with a 530, but the 430 is perfectly adequate. Pretty soon we're going to make the descent down to 2,000 feet, and here we start it. Now, on a descent you have to be very careful with the RPM. I'm running quite a high RPM to try to maintain speed. But you don't want to redline the RPM as you descend. You can see it creeping up a little bit there. So you're always looking to back off the throttle as you're descending and adding power when you're climbing. Now if you look at the airspeed, we're about 120 knots. Flap speed is about 85. So as we continue the approach, I'm going to stop backing off on the power. So coming up to the IF in a little while, and the runway itself will start to become visible. And we will be heading directly towards it. Coming down in height, looking for 2,000 feet, and all this information comes from the charts, of course. And we're going to be down to 2,000. Good time. And because you're using autopilot, it frees you up for radio communications and whatever else you need to do. Okay, so I'm now backing off the throttle, getting the speed down, looking to put airspeed into the white arc. And as we approach the IF, we're going to make a slight left turn under autopilots. Should be able to see the runways there. And we're down at 2,000 feet. and turning to runway heading. The one advantage I feel the Airfoil Labs autopilot has is that it does capture an altitude, it doesn't go straight through it. At least with this version of X-Plane and the X-Plane autopilot, it will go straight through it. You have to manually hit the altitude button to hold that altitude, which just adds a little bit to the workload. Okay, autopilot off. I'm going to start preparing the aircraft for landing, so flaps 10. It'll be a flaps 20 landing. Just keeping the nose down. Looking for center line. Looking at a landing speed of about 60 knots, or at least 55 to 60 knots. I'm looking for approximately 500 FPM descent. I'm going a little bit higher than that, 700. Just looking at the runway, concentrating more on the runway than the descent rate. VSI is important, but you have to keep that picture of the runway firmly in mind. That's what's guiding you down onto the runway. Aim point is the numbers. Touchdown point a little way beyond the numbers. Now I make a mistake on this landing. I'm a little bit left. I end up using a little bit of left rudder to correct on landing, and because of that I'm not quite off the rudder as quick as I should have been, and I have a little bit of a skid on landing. So I'm going a little bit too far left. Just watching the airspeed, paying attention to the VSI, but the main focus has to be on the runway itself. Keeping it stationary, not allowing it to move up or move down, just keeping it right in that same spot, keeping the nose down. Just a little bit to the left. This was the place I should have corrected for that. But 500 FPM. And as I cross the threshold, I'll idle the power. Now there's no ground effect here, so the aircraft will always just pretty much sink onto the runway. That I believe will be corrected, or has been corrected in 11.1. You are just a little bit to the left. End up going right and then giving it a little bit of left rudder to correct. Just a little bit of a skid there on touchdown, but not a bad landing. In fact, rated as good. And here we are at Marseille. So that has been a flight from Nice down the coast to Marseille in the stock Cessna 172. And here we are, just looking for a parking spot. So as always, hope you enjoyed that flight, and feel free to like, comment and subscribe.